Professor Harding for inviting me here today, as well as Kathy. I'm very excited to be here. As Andrew mentioned, I am a UVic grad, so I finished in 2001, and that would have been, to think that I'd be here 8 years later discussing this, I wouldn't possibly imagine that. So thank you very much for coming today. I'm just going to start by a bit of background to how this research came about. In 2005, I basically moved to Hong Kong from Australia, and I started working with a regional NGO called the Asian Human Rights Commission. So my role with them was to work on issues regarding editing as well, which eventually evolved into lobbying the Hong Kong business community over human rights issues. I also had specific case studies where I've worked on the portfolios of Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Thailand. So I was based there 2 years and continued on afterwards. But what made this experience interesting for me and kind of changed my perception of things was at the same time I was working for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So I was literally splitting my day in the morning working for the Human Rights Commission, and in the afternoon the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Again, so at the Human Rights Commission I worked on things mostly regarding around torture and weak rule of law issues. And again, what we kind of talked about all the time was how judiciaries and policing were not working in the region. When I went over to the Chamber of Commerce, I was talking a lot about IP protection. We were talking about corruption. And again, what happened was, what was the problems for this? Well, we were talking about weak law enforcement and judiciaries. So it turns out that when I look back, I was having the same conversation twice a day, but using totally different language. And these two groups were not communicating at all. In fact, at one point I even organized a meeting between the executive directors of each organization, and it was the most awkward half an hour that I could possibly describe. Everyone just kept saying, "We support you, we support you," and then it kind of just ended. But what it made me think is, there's some common ground here, and that eventually led to this research, which I did at again, City University in Hong Kong. My supervisor, who I worked on this with, is Stephen Frost, who is the director of a social enterprise in Hong Kong called CSR Asia. So I went in from this angle, working with him and coming in with this perception of why are these communities not talking? So basically, this is the background, which I kind of already mentioned, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. But the main thing is there was a major gap between the language with these people, with the conversation that I was having, and then the practice on the ground. The pragmatic stuff and the theory. There was just gaps. There was gaps in conversations, there was gaps in research, and I didn't understand why this was happening. So this is what led me to CityU. Now, I've looked at primarily these three countries, Cambodia, China, and Thailand. Originally my plan was to look at a lot more, but again, time and financial constraints kind of had to narrow the comparative study down. The reason I picked these three is when I started to think about this, when I started at the university in 2006, these were the countries in Hong Kong that the business community and human rights community was talking about the most. China was getting their new labor contract law, if you remember. So the business community was very paranoid about what this was going to do for industry. Right? Would they have to start, actually abiding by the law? Could that law even be forced? That's another question. But the issue was around the contract law. In Cambodia, you might recall in 2005, right, oil was discovered. Right? ExxonMobil discovered a whole heap of oil. In the human rights community, there was a lot of fear on how these resources were going to be used, who was going to go after them, and what was going to happen. Thailand, of course, in 2006, we had a coup, right? So again, business in Hong Kong and the human rights community, for months, just talking about what was happening with Thaksin, what did this mean for the business community, the stability of Thailand, and so there was a lot of discussions around this. So the method I use, I'm just going to run through this today, and what I'm going to do, I'm only going to talk about 20, 25 minutes, and I'm going to kind of highlight some main issues, and then hopefully we can discuss this here, because I know I'm in a room with people that probably know a lot more about this stuff than I do. But my research is carried out in mostly these cities. It's based on 60 in-depth, I guess, semi-structured interviews with business, mostly business, as well as government officials, some NGOs, and academics. It's also based on many more informal conversations that are off the record. Again, I've been active on the Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong for the past 5 years. Even to this day, we're still, right now we're drafting a code of conduct for the Chamber. But in that time, I had the opportunity to attend a lot of conferences, a lot of international conferences, and so many anecdotal examples. Of course, I couldn't go into the research because the stuff was largely off the record. So this was a major drive in pushing these 60 interviews. And then, of course, I had attended 6 major workshops, 2 which were industry conferences, which were anti-corruption conferences, one in Singapore and one in Hong Kong. And then there was a business and human rights conference in Paris, and then a few more in Hong Kong. Mostly all industry conferences. These weren't academic conferences. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, when I'm talking about corporate social responsibility, this is this pretty standard definition that the World Bank uses. There's a lot of definitions around CSR, right, which we call CSR, but there's no kind of agreed upon definition yet. It's still something that's evolving. There's a lot of perspectives out there saying, it's mostly about sustainability, it's mostly about staying in business and environment. Others are saying it's not, you must put more emphasis on the social side. But of course, CSR changes from country to country, region to region. Even in China, CSR strategies are very different in Shanghai than they are in the countryside for a company. But this is kind of what we call the triple bottom line, which is this kind of thing here, which is pretty much a standard. What are we getting at when we're talking about CSR? It's mostly social, environmental, and economic. So those 3 combined issues that we're moving to. And what am I talking about corruption? This conversation I'm having today is trying to link these 2 issues. This is an old definition by Joseph Nye. The reason I'm using this is because I know it's an interdisciplinary audience, and it might be familiar to many of you, but in the research I use a lot of local theory and local examples, but this is a pretty standard corruption definition. What I'm looking at specifically is the bribery section of corruption. So, and specifically how foreign industry engages in bribery, and what does that do? And I'm trying to kind of look at the nexus between that and human rights violations. Now, I'm convinced, and I know I'm going to be making this argument till the day I die, but there is a fundamental connection between corruption and human rights violations in developing states. And it's endemic. And so when I'm talking about corruption in the 3 countries I'm talking about, I am referring to it up, I would argue it's right from the bottom almost to the top of all state agents. And by when I'm saying state agents, I'm referring to low-ranking police officers all the way up to, in some countries, not all, but in some, right up to the top of the country. Now, it's controversial, but from a human rights perspective, this is how we look at it. When I was working with the HRC and the stuff I've done in human rights, the connection between low petty bribe and what it does to institutions is detrimental. So for me, there's a strong connection, but I know that's debatable for some. So what exactly is corruption in Asia? How are they doing? Well, as many people in this room probably know, Hong Kong and Singapore, and of course Australia and New Zealand are always at the top. Countries I'm looking at here, right? China kind of came in 13th in Asia, but 79th in the world. Thailand, 14th corrupt in Asia, 84th in the world. And poor Cambodia down here ends up coming in 30th in Asia and 158th in the world. So this is from Transparency International, this ranking, the 2009 ranking. This is just, and it's based on perceptions, as we know, right? So this is kind of perceptions of mostly business executives and people working in these countries, how do they perceive things. So when I'm talking about human rights, what am I talking about? The definition I'm using about human rights here is the standard UN definition based on basic rights. So in human rights, there's different generations, right? There's first generation, which we call the basic fundamental rights, the stuff in the UN Declaration. And then we have second generation rights, which include a lot more things about civil liberties. And then I know there's talk now even third generation rights, which are more along the lines of environment. The stuff I'm talking about here is basic human rights. So the responsibility that the state has not to do with you. So I'm not talking about what the state has to provide you. I'm talking about what the state has to refrain from doing to you. Okay? And so how does business play in this kind of area? So business and human rights in Asia. I know this is controversial for some, but I will argue that business cannot commit a direct human rights violation because they are not recognized in international law. You can't take a business to the International Criminal Court and sue them. Just last week, right, the human rights community had a lot of support around the U.S. kind of Alien Torts Act. You probably saw this, you know, and but then a judge kind of killed it last week, saying that you can't use this law to go after foreign companies, companies operating abroad. I said excluding state-owned enterprises. SOEs is state-owned enterprises. So businesses that are specifically linked to government. So in China, we have a lot of those, of course. And it's this kind of where the government is a shareholder or the board has government representatives. And then all the three case studies I'm looking at, a lot of companies have that connection. But business can be very complicit in human rights violations. And this is where I'm looking at, is the complicity. So this image is here of Bhopal, a very famous example that, you know, Union Carbide gets a lot of bad, you know, press about. If you're familiar with this, this is kind of a disaster in India in the 80s. And the company is constantly referred to as, you know, not apologizing, not doing this. You know, they've just done a horrible job at communicating with the company. They haven't, you know, I think they only apologized recently, if they even have. You know, a terrible, terrible part of the company. But, right, why did this happen? Why was this company allowed to get away with terrible working conditions? Why was this company allowed to, you know, get away with you know, overworking people and ignoring safety precautions? And this is where I come in with the link with corruption, because, you know, we know now that there was significant bribes going to the Indian officials. We're not looking at this stuff. So the business was able to pay money to get, you know, officials, governments to look the other way. So it's easy for us to go after this company, but there's a whole other side to this, and it's the government being completely unaccountable for allowing this to happen at the time. Of course, they've become a lot more accountable now, but at the time, it's this link. So I'm just going to outline what I'm talking about. What are the drivers of corporate social responsibility? So who's talking about this? And I've kind of narrowed it down to these 5 groups here. The top one, epistemic community, I'm just referring to experts. And the reason I'm saying this is because in pretty much all the meetings of dozens of workshops, you know, major conferences, companies drafting their CSR policies, right? Asia-Pacific policies. It's always the same people at these meetings. It's always the same keynotes. Okay, they rotate. Right? And there's a link, right? So we have experts, right? And these people could be some very, you know, well-connected consultants. It could be ex-government officials, and they could be academics, of course, right? And then you have this group here, and you have the kind of the middle people that kind of communicate this expert advice into all these groups, that are then all going after different approaches to CSR. I would also argue there's competing interests here, okay? And NGOs and IGOs and business and government, they all have different perceptions of what CSR actually is. This is one of my things that I'll get to in the end, but when I say it's human rights where's the dialogue? Well, the relationship between business and NGOs, right, it's much stronger between the environmental NGOs and the business community. I've been in meetings where I'm trying to pitch a human rights, view, and I think it's kind of been sidelined by the environmental NGOs. Because at the end of the day, we're competing for money. We won't like to admit that, but we are, okay? There's also, this is a skewed power relationship here. Government is much larger. If this was supposed to be down to where the power is, government would be kind of like this, and NGOs would be kind of like this. IGOs facilitate it, and I would argue business kind of responds. They just are responding to different stakeholders. In China, the government is clearly the strongest driver of CSR at the moment. It's been pretty much, directed to the harmonious society policy. They've kind of positioned themselves as saying state-owned enterprises have to adopt these things. It's not saying the same for private enterprises, but there's a strong push from government. In Cambodia, it's almost nothing. There's almost no talk from the government, right? Which might explain why companies aren't doing anything about CSR or not talking about it. And in Thailand, it's kind of just starting, I'd say. There's always been kind of, incentives behind companies, giving to the community, but it's been very much a public relations exercise. There's been nothing kind of sustainable about it until, well, we're seeing some changes now. So, the 4 questions I asked, or I should say, I asked 5 main research questions. This was one of them, right? What are the drivers of CSR? This is the second one. So what is the business case? And when I'm saying what is the business case, I'm referring to why should any company care about this, right? Where's the money from this? The short answer is, unfortunately, there is no business case. And this is something I begrudgingly kind of concluded. But there is no incentive for industry to get on board with anti-corruption and human rights strategies in China, because the short, and Southeast Asia, because the short game is too powerful, okay? Employees are not promoted, their performance reviews are not promoted on their social responsibility practices, okay? Employees are not given resources, they're not given incentives to kind of push these views. Okay? In fact, they could be going against the organizational structure of their company if they were to take strong stances against this stuff. The other thing is corruption, right, is something that is very perception driven. So my idea of a bribe, which I would say, you paid this person this much money to get something, might be seen as perceived as just a what they call in the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, a facilitation payment to get something moving in bureaucracy. So it's considered maybe just like a soft tax, right? Something that's not really that bad. So there's a perception that if I were to say, well, no, this is bribery, is corruption, there's views that say, no, it's not. But of course, the long answer is much more complex, right? Of course, there's a business case for human rights and corruption, but it's a long one. I'll get more to this in a second, but the main thing here is these 4 institutions: governance, judiciary, police, and corruption. These are have major impacts on industry. Okay, and I'm referring to non-independent judiciaries, right, and the enforcement factor of business. So if you have a company that's complaining about their intellectual property being stolen, but then of course they realize there's no police to come do anything about it. In a lot of these countries, it doesn't work. So why is this picture right here, right? One of the things I put this up here because this is an Amnesty International ad from the Beijing Olympics, and of course they had major international campaign about human rights in China. If you went on the website, it would tell you to send letters to businesses that were sponsoring the Olympics, right? For instance, send letters to Coca-Cola, Nike, McDonald's, all these big companies that were involved in this stuff. The thing is I've talked to some of these companies, these sponsors, and you say, well, what is happening here, right? Well, we're dealing with, a government responding to, struggling, which you will, with institutions, and clear human rights violations happening. But then you have the companies that are sponsoring events like this that are getting the kind of attack from civil society. And I said, well, you know, I asked one company, I mean, why is this happening? What are you doing? And, you know, she told me, you know, she was the director of Asia Pacific, and she was getting, you know, the letters, and just saying, you know, it's very frustrating because we have no mechanism to lobby on this policy issue. And if we did, it would be so political that we would be kicked out of the country. And if we did get kicked out of the country, that would be great. That's the excuse. They want to kick us out of the country because then they can do their own localized brand of it. Okay? So there's a significant disconnect between what business perceives as their ability to influence human rights and what they think is responsible. So a company will look at this and say, you know, this isn't me, this has nothing to do with me. But the human rights movement says this has everything to do with you. There's a fundamental gap in the conversations happening here. So the next question I asked is, what impact does corruption and human rights have on business? I'm just going to kind of point to a couple of these, and I'm going to talk about why this picture's here. And first thing is human rights has a minimal impact. Again, this conversation, you ask a company, the companies I've talked to, say, what is human rights? Say, well, it's not mine, it's out of our sphere of influence. Right? Not my responsibility, it's purely a government issue. Right? But you ask about bribery, and you say, well, what about bribery and corruption? It gets a bit more sensitive, right? There isn't an issue there, because a lot of the businesses are involved in directly paying bribes. And you know, I would argue in some of these countries, it's impossible to do business without paying bribes. It's impossible. So even once you go into them, right, you're going to be, if you know, come up against these challenges at some point. The issue here is, I want to say, is this here, right? Human rights is supported. Some companies do support human rights, but from what I've found is that these companies have been purely driven by their CEOs or their executives, right? Human rights has been pushed down to the company because of a certain culture that the company wants to have. But it's been personal. And so when that CEO or these executives leave, and this has happened, and they leave the company and go to a different company, that company loses its original human rights interests, and the next company may take it. So this is shifting, it's individually driven. Corruption, on the other hand, right, is largely seen as a business issue. But in a lot of countries, business doesn't talk about it, right? They don't talk about this stuff, even though everyone's doing it. You know, in Thailand, I had one conversation with someone that, an executive director of a chamber, who said he can't get his members on board of corruption because of the view that they will be, you know, killed if they bring up these issues. If some of you might have heard of this story, in 1999, there was an Australian auditor sent to Thailand to audit a corruption, an audit company accused of corruption in a sugar company. It's Michael Weasley. Anyways, in 99, he was on his way to the office, and he kind of got killed by passing by a motorcycle, right? This story happened in 99, but it's very vivid in the business community's memory in Thailand. Right? They'll still talk about this like it's yesterday. So if you were to say, all right, why don't you just take a stand about corruption? I said, well, you know, they'll come and kill me if I do. Okay, so the managers in multinational corporations on the ground, a lot of them are expatriates. They're placed there with families, right? And so, you know, they're working in an organization, but they're facing real fears of their livelihoods. The same thing happened to a member of the Thai Board of Trade, right, who had received when I took, my information was that he had received a letter bomb, a mock letter bomb, and said, you know, you better stop asking questions about corruption. Of course, the Thai Board of Trade has many, you know, vice directors, so I don't expose this person, but you know, there's very serious risk of bringing these issues up. The next question was, sorry, I should say this question, well, I'll come back to, I'll move through this, we can come back about these pictures here in a minute. But the next question was, what is the political risk, right? Is there a political risk? And this image here, I'll just talk about this as being, this is the risk, right? The ultimate risk of human rights violations and corruption, right? We know Thaksin, the government in Thailand is engaged in a lot of human rights violations. They were a highly corrupt government, and you know, there was protests, right? A coup, right? Ousted leaders. So when I say, well, is this a business risk for companies in Thailand? And I say, well, yes, of course it is, but it isn't really. And if we were to ask, why is it not that? And the same kind of answers kept coming up. It's because, well, the coup leaders still support, free markets. So it doesn't matter what kind of coup happens in this country, right? It's going to still be support for the international market. So when I asked some of the executives I was talking to, so what do you spend your day doing? Well, I probably have to spend several hours of my day or week convincing headquarters that this will pass, the next government will help make it business. So the view is that there is a risk, of course there's a risk, but it's not, it's temporary. Okay? And then the last point I just want to say, an intermediary, right? Intermediaries are kind of these consultants that work sometimes in law firms and sometimes in consultancies, and they kind of get your company in touch with local people on the ground. I was talking to one person who's been based in Hong Kong probably the last 15 years, and he has been giving the same talk about the risks of corruption and the risks of human rights in Asia to the business community since 1992. He's given the exact same presentation. So he said, so when you talk about business, do they learn of these costs and this risk, these social risks, right? He says they don't, and they keep him in business. So the last question I asked is, can they influence government? And I would argue no. Human rights, as much as I want to say companies can influence policy on the human rights level, I don't think they can. I think they can influence policy through best practice, right? They can show international best standards. They can influence the corruption dialogue, because there's a lot of stakeholders there. But the human rights conversations I've had with companies that go right to the top are terrified about bringing this issue up. And they won't. I have these brands up here because some of these companies, they're all major companies around Asia and China. And the reason I'm saying this is the inherent kind of contradiction that I kept getting also from locally based companies who say, you want to talk about corporate social responsibility, a lot of them will just kind of reference these guys and say, well, do you really want these companies lobbying human rights for you, right? Do you want Philip Morris to say, we're supporting human rights? And is that even ethical? Like, a cigarette company. Interestingly, I was at a talk where Philip Morris was giving a presentation of their time in their business in Malaysia, and they're getting hit for being an irresponsible company. And you say, well, outside Philip Morris, the second largest competitor in Malaysia for tobacco is the black market. So what's more responsible? If they leave, or do they work to improve the system? Another company I talked to in a beer company working in Cambodia, I asked them, I said, what's your social responsibility here? He said, well, we work a lot on helmet laws in this country because a lot of people are going out getting on scooters and drunk and falling off and dying. And it comes back to they're using our products. But then I said, well, what's your risk with the government? What's your relationship? He said, well, our relationship's quite strong, but to be honest, 30% of alcohol sales in Cambodia are smuggled in through government officials. So our greatest competitor is corrupt officials. And so when you think, so how does that relationship work? And anyways, that's another conversation. But what does this all mean? More sides. The main one is this, is I kind of put it down to, three main issues. Is why is this happening? And the first is this perception of corporate disempowerment. Companies really believe, the individuals and companies believe they are powerless to push the human rights argument on the policy level of an official. And they are powerless to deal with corruption issues. A lot of the companies I've talked to, the heads of corporate social responsibility in these companies, said we have no budget we have all these demands and then no budget to kind of institute an anti-corruption program or improve labor, right? And then when I'm reviewed on my performance, I know I said this already, but it's critical. And then when I'm reviewed, right, I don't get asked any questions on did I support human rights or did I not pay a bribe, right? There's no incentive, and there's an incentive for me to keep doing what I'm doing. Even though in their personal realm, right, they very much support human rights, or they're very much against corruption. The next thing is the divergent stakeholder interests, and this again comes down to you have a lot of stakeholders with a lot of different goals. Right? And again, from the human rights side and the human rights argument, it's constantly being pushed down. Because a big company can say, we talk to NGOs, we engage civil society, but then when you look at who they're talking to, it's about politically neutral issues, like children, right, health, and environment. Okay? So, I mean, everyone has different views on this stuff, but the issue is, of course, it's less political. The hard stuff they don't talk about, but they can still claim a connection to civil society that they're doing CSR. So it's kind of pushing the human rights arguments aside. And this last one is embedded neoliberalism. And I've kind of put this here is at the end of the day, one of my main conclusions is CSR is this. It's extremely important for the business community. I know on all sides, on the far left and far right, often CSR is considered nonsense, right? So if you were to say, ask one person, say, a hard-nosed business person, and you were to say, is CSR beneficial? So it's nonsense. We're here about making money, and that's it. We're not here to save the world, right? But if you were to ask a far left person, say, what do you think about human rights? And they say, well, or CSR, they say, well, it's corporatization of society, right? Who's to give a business the power to decide where social funds should go? So there's this there's this, both extremes are against it. But what neoliberalism does, is, as we know it, is this kind of promotion of capitalism. And when you look at the way the CSR arguments have emerged in the 90s, in the late 90s, and this is what I would argue that China is, and this is the big China thing, is why China is pushing this, is because Western firms, I would argue, they can't compete against Chinese enterprises that are growing faster. They didn't anticipate this. So you look at Western firms pushing all this, all the subcontracting, right, and outsourcing to Asia, right, notably China, Bangladesh, India, and they are to keep the prices down, right? So on the one hand, the neoliberalism stuff is this constant demand, this race to the bottom. They have to do it. So how do you rectify the social responsibility and the race to the bottom? But on the other is, I've had conversations with people where they said, China can get a better price, and I said, I went to China to find out, one company told me they went there to investigate, how is that possible? How can you get a better price? And they went and investigated on the ground, and of course, right, the company was using prisoners, right, prison labor. So they constantly can, they can offer a better rate. So, and this is notably happening now where Chinese firms are out-competing Western firms, for contracts, especially out-competing the World Bank, out-competing the IMF, right? A lot of companies are going to. So one of the things is, how do you compete with this? Well, right, this is where you get the international organizations constantly pushing CSR, saying you need to push it because this will make sure that these companies come back up to our level because they're undercutting us. We can't compete with them. So on the institutional level, I think CSR is a natural, it's a natural extension of neoliberalism because it brings back the level playing field for Western firms. And so the last slide, I won't say anything about this, but the main issue is what can business do? These best practice standards, right? The companies that were doing the best from my research in their spheres of influence were abiding as best they could by as many international principles as they could integrate into the company. But it must be holistic. It can't just be one department. It can't just be one CSR unit. Right? It has to be the whole company on board with it. And it must come from the top. Right? Companies where the CSR is coming from the bottom, doesn't work. Anyways, I think I will leave it there. I think we went a bit over time, so thank you very much.